So with new site 2, the way we've been getting data has just been literally importing our data in a JSON file, which isn't how applications actually do that. So with app.js, we're just importing news.json, and then we're parsing out that data and just displaying it in our React component, which isn't how in real world applications they do that. They end up dispatching an API or a GET request and to some database somewhere, some server somewhere, and then getting that data back, parsing it and everything, and then rendering that data onto the client. And how we've been doing that with Django is, where's Django? In our views, in our URLs, they come to a path and it goes to our views. And then in our views, we dispatch or do a GET request to some API or go into our database and grab that data, parse it, and then pass it into a template. But we're not using template anymore. We're using React. And we use post requests, we use GET requests, and then we parse that, run like a JSON method on it that parses it into JSON and then pushes that into our template. And that at that point we can render whatever information we need. But with React, we're going to be using a different type of GET request. JavaScript is a fetch API. We kind of covered it a few weeks ago, but let's just kind of go over it. So in our new site 3, so when you npm, let's just go over the fetch API, which is how we're going to grab data in JavaScript. Let's go up here. I'm just going to go into promises fetch. Cool. So I've got this CD. I'm going to lecture. Is that the right one? Did I go up too far? Oops. What is going on? Is it 2 or 3? It's 2. There we go. CD promise fetch. Let's open index HTML. So right here we have this to-do index, and right here we have our hello world, which is using this app.js, which is right here. Now, in order to get data, I'm going to have to create, actually dispatch to a server some API endpoint, how we were doing with Ticketmaster. It's all done in the URL based off of the parameters we pass in that URL. Depends on what kind of data we get back. Yeah. Remember that in Ticketmaster? Yeah. So JavaScript has this thing called the fetch API. Let's bring it up. Fetch API. We've kind of gone over it real quickly in the past, but that fetch API provides an interface for fetching resources, including across the network. It will seem similar to anyone using XML HTTP request, which is an old standard or an old way. It's called an AJAX request. This is the new way to do it. It's a lot cleaner, and it prevents something called callback hell. True. So the fetch has this method that takes in one mandatory argument and the path to the resource you want to fetch. So JSON placeholder. So there's this website called JSON placeholder that just can grab stuff, like any kind of JSON data for you to practice with. Here's an example. So fetch, just do this in here. Fetch. Then it takes in the method takes in one mandatory argument the path to the resource you want to fetch. So in this case, it's going to be like this HTTP. Let's just throw this in the browser and see what comes out. Oh, I mean, not that. Does that work now? There we go. So this is what's being returned if I visit this URL. And in Ticketmaster, this was kind of the same thing. When you would visit that URL, all this would be displayed. We'll get the raw parsed. So with this URL, we can pass in if we want to grab this information. Right here. Fetch API, and it takes in it as a string. Now, fetch actually returns something called a promise. A promise is essentially just a way to turn asynchronous actions into synchronous actions. So where'd it go? Where'd my notes go? So yeah, it just allows synchronous actions to return values and act like synchronous actions. Let's look at what the document about promise. Promises. MDM. And the reason why it returns a promise, because say you dispatch this to an API and it's supposed to return that JSON that we showed you before. This information. And what if you needed to manipulate this information? And if you just had like assign this to a variable, like let data equal fetch API, and then you needed to manipulate that data, like function manipulate. This is all just, you're going to take in data and then do something with the data. This might take a while to grab, but this method is still going to execute if I manipulate. So if this takes like a few seconds or something to actually go and get and send back, but this manipulate data is running at the same time. So it won't actually have access to this data yet. So it's going to throw an error, just like nothing. So a promise essentially ensures that whatever data you want comes back first, and then it's going to execute another function, another set of actions, set of instructions. That's what fetch does.
So anywhere fetch might be a chain of functions. It's always going to be priority. It's always going to execute first.
Well, it's not necessarily executing first.
Okay.
Like for this, it returns a promise, whatever. And then this doesn't mean like this automatically returns first. It doesn't mean like comes to here, it hits this one first, and then it moves on to this one. That's not what it means. So, but the way it works, use fetch, and then if we want to do another set of instructions, we do dot then. It could be like dot then. And what this returns gets passed into this, which this then method is another function. And what gets passed into this parameter is the result of this.
Oh.
So takes in a response, and let's just console log this response. Don't need any of this data. And this is specific to HTTP requests and APIs because it takes a little while to get, like, go across the network and everything like that. So here's my to-do. Here's my response. So I refreshed it, came into this fetch, grabbed that data, And then it passed in the response of that data into this method, this callback method. Now we're console logging the response. So it knows this is a response. So this is everything that's coming back in this HTTP request. So it's got headers, body use false, it's got body, it's got this URL. And now, in order to actually extrapolate the data that we want from this, which is that this, we call another dot then. This is really bad formatting. Now the data in here, return response. So the return value over here, it gets passed into here as a parameter. And now we can actually get the data that we want. We want to grab this data. So let's look at what that looks like. Where did that API go? Right here. So if I refresh, oh, what happened? Right here. Then oh no, where am I?
Really changing the state of it, are you?
No. Well, like every time the second callback, it changes like what you're actually getting back. Boarding fetch, interface fetch, where is it? Using fetch. Won't reject APS. Okay, this is all fine. We're going to get into await later on, but yeah. So the second dot then should extrapolate the data that we actually want. Let's response. Then data, console log data. Why isn't it showing up? Am I missing something? Response dot then. Oh, I'm an idiot. I know why. So the reason why it's not showing, because we actually have to call .json on it to turn that into a JSON object for us to use. And then we're passing in that JSON object back into here. So the return of here gets passed into the parameter of this next dot then, and then we can utilize that data. Hopefully that worked. There we go. And have you seen this arrow function look like this before?
No.
Okay, so if you're only returning one thing, you don't need the squiggly, the brackets, and you don't need the return statement. If you're only returning one thing and you're not doing other stuff in this dot then method. So if I was doing something like console logging, I would need that return method.
That's similar to when you do like a lambda function.
Yeah, I'm not like 1,000,000% confident with lambda functions. Personally, I've never used them before, but yeah.
It's the same idea because you're making a really simple function that only does one thing, and you're using it just right there.
So in here, we can actually get rid of that square, or those brackets. We can get rid of this. We can get rid of that bracket. And we can also get rid of the return. And same with here. But usually in here, we're gonna have to like only get the specific data we want. So we might like assign a function, let some, or yeah, some do a variable and do stuff with this JSON. Yeah. So that's how the fetch API works. Like that. Yeah.
Oh, why is it an API? It's just because it refers to outside
Because it,
pathway.
yeah, because we're using this URL to grab data from that JSON placeholder.com. And
so fetch is
it's used for API.
it's used.
So you won't be passing anything else in here. Like you'll pretty much only be passing in the URL of where that data exists. So like the Ticketmaster URL, we can go in here too. The Google Maps, anything that will return JSON data. Yes, Mark.
So what is the API actually? Like I understand what it does, but what is it? I understand the word API. The API is like
That's what it
but
is.
what is the API?
This would be the API.
Is it the URL?
Yeah, essentially that URL will grab that data.
It's like an address.
Yeah. That's what like the application programming interface is just the name. That whole process. Use an API.
So it would be the API for, let's say like Google Maps would be basically the URLs that you use to interact with the database, or the process of using those URLs. So they have different rules with how the URL kind of like
Correct.
almost like a language that you use in the URLs to actually access it.
Yes. Okay. So I can actually assign this URL to here. And the reason why we're doing this is because this is how we're going to interact with our Django app and grabbing data from a backend.
Taking it from the URL page.
Yeah, we're going to essentially create a route to data within our Django app, and we're going to dispatch or fetch data from our API that we set up in our database. We're not going to do that. We're going to do it in the next several days, but that's the overall how we're going to link the front end of React to Django.
So does the backend Django open how it's not?
No, it's no. So do that. Where am I? And the same thing. So there's this. We can do fetch. So we do grab this. It returns a promise, and then we do this .then. So the response of this fetch. The response of this fetch URL gets passed in as a parameter in this this other function, which then returns response, and we're converting it to JSON, and then that JSON is getting then passed in as a parameter to this function, and then we're console logging it. Now, that's just how we use promises, and like that's exactly what a promise is. Because if we, as I said before, if we were trying to grab this data and then do something with it before we got like an actual response back, it's going to throw an error. It makes asynchronous actions essentially act like synchronous actions. So it's like do step one, we get the response of step one, we grab the response from step one, pass it into step two, do some action on it, and we get the response of step two, we pass that response into step three, and then we just keep kind of going down. That's what the fetch API does, return to promise. Now you can chain, like let some promise equals a new promise is actually like something. Like we can just actually get a promise object, and you can read the documentation and create your own objects or promises. But yeah. There's also another way we can write this fetch URL. called async await. It's another way to work with promises. So I'm going to create a function. Actually, in this index file, where'd that index file go? Div. Did you ever know you can do, what is a div? Is it hashtag? You do. That just automatically does that. Anyway, so I actually want to insert this to do into that div. So what is it? Document let element let what should I call this variable? So some HTML equal document dot get element by ID. What is it? To do. Then this JSON, it's console log. So I'll look at this one more time because I want that to do to show up there. So I just want the title. Return some HTML dot inner. Is it inner text or inner HTML? Equals JSON dot title. That work? There we go. Oh, sorry. So in my index.html, I created just an empty div with an ID of to do. And then my app.js, I grab that ID or that element. And in here, I've got that JSON file that has just a big object that has a user ID, a title, an ID, and a completed. And I'm just returning, I'm grabbing that div, and I'm doing inner HTML. I can also do let title equals JSON.title. I'm just going to return the title.
You're taking the div element with the get element by ID.
Yep.
And that creates the element in this context. And then inner HTML throws whatever's on the other side of the
the equal side.
Inside of that element.
Correct. So I'm just doing that just to show it on the screen.
Okay.
I'm going to actually wrap this in a function. Function to do. And I'm just going to move all this stuff in that function. I'm just going to return, because this is a function that I have to return. Does it still work? No, it does not. Oh, because I'm not invoking the function. I'm invoking that function. Hopefully I didn't break anything. There we go. Now there's another way to do this dot fetch. Let's see if this works. So if I do function to do again, I know it. Invoking it. And I want to grab the response. Oh, hold on. Just going to comment this out. Something called async await. If I do the async, I do await, fetch, excuse you, URL. If I use this keyword async await, it knows this function is like, it's an async keyword. If I put async in front of the function, anytime I put await fetch, then I take that response and do, what do I call it? Data equals response.json. I put await in front of that. then return data.
You need an E on this one.
Return data. So what this does, essentially acts like an asynchronous function, makes it act synchronously. It's just like this fetch.then. It goes run this and wait to get to the response, and then move on to the next one. Await. Once we get the response from this one, perform this one, and then return the data. Let's see if this actually works. Might not. That work? Yep. So that's another way of just using the fetch.then. You can fetch it, then wait, this await keyword. Make sure that this one, after this one is done processing, then move on to the next one. Then this has an await to it. Once this one's done processing, move on to this one. And then just like execute everything else. So that's another way, this async await.
So in terms of putting a weight, should you only put a weight on everything, or should you only put things on that you would expect to be delayed?
Correct. Only put a weight on things you'd expect to that might need like time or asynchronous actions that you need to put a weight on functions or items that you know you might need the data and manipulate the data later on. And you don't know like specifically when you're going to get that data back. So we don't necessarily know when this data is going to come back. It could take, you know, a few milliseconds to several seconds. So this to do is exactly the same thing as this.
So you don't want the processing of that data to delay the rest of the functionality of the app. So the app can continue.
Well, the app's going to still do, but like this response, I need this response to be completed. I need to get the data back before I move on to this response.json.
I'm just struggling with like a real world example.
Oh, you're going to see it, yeah.
Okay.
This fetch, it happens all the time when you're using APIs. We're always doing asynchronous actions, and we have to turn them into synchronous actions. And that's all about APIs.
If I can take a stab, I think I understand where you're kind of pointing at. It's not so much like a speed thing, like you want the page to render and not to wait for things. You just can't call on something. It's a matter of you're defining something and you're going to use it later. If you're going to use it later, it's going to break because this isn't done yet. So it's all a matter of relying on that for other things rather than not slowing the process down.
And this function,
maybe that's how we were.
no, yeah, so you are 100% correct. So this function, just because I have async, that doesn't mean everything else in the entire application isn't like running. It just means in the context of this method, this function, kind of wait to get this response, then we're going to manipulate it. If we don't have this response back, if this isn't done processing, it won't move on to do this.
It won't move on within that function, but it might put that function on hold until it gets back to promise and start processing some other part of your code.
Yes. Yeah.
So if you didn't have that,
It couldn't break. Yeah.
So how often do you just kind of start coding your thing and then it breaks and you're like, oh, I should use a wait? Or do you get to a point to where you just know, like, okay, I'm ready to do an await because this is going to take a little bit longer?
Yeah. You get to that point.
You get to that point.
Yeah. And there's like certain scenarios where you'll default use await or the fetch.then. Like anytime you're dispatching, essentially every time you're getting data from a database, at some point, you're going to be using await or
Anytime
database.
you're getting data from any source other than the code itself or the memory,
Yeah,
for some function that you wrote. So another interesting example of this is deaf grandma. You could rewrite that grandma using asynchronous functions because your user input is what it was waiting for and why it would go into that loop. Because it didn't know when your user input was going to come, so it would jump to the next thing and not have yet received the input and get stuck in the loop. But if you wrote that grandma as an asynchronous function, you could have it await the user input and the user enter, and then it would work.
Yep. So we're going to be using this fetch API a lot in new site 3. So let's take a 5-minute break. We've been at 10:31, and then we're going to go over new site 3 and walk through it kind of together.
Good.